Hello, am I audible? Is the volume okay? Okay. Three, two, one. A large portion of the population in status quo has been left behind by a multi-partisan promise of secularization. A multi-party consensus, whether you're the Tories or the Labour Party in the UK, that we must live on an assumption that the secular society is the basis of our principles of the state. It is also a society marred in status quo by interreligious strife. That's to say, even as we've agreed to live on democracy, the fact that people have vastly conflicting systems of morality on things like abortion, on things like what is the true religion and what does my salvation entail, means that even as we try to approach a more civil discourse, there are very many instances when these things oftentimes bubble to the fore. We look like when people believe that abortion is literally the genocide of millions of babies every day and are willing to engage in violence violence against things like abortion clinics because they believe it's an attack on their inherent salvation, and because they are continually funding taxes to places like the United States, they're complicit and literally going to hell for it. We think we ought to make sure that these people are not left behind by secularization any longer, to allow them to live in places they can fully and freely practice their religion without the need for violence and without the need for moral compromise that tax their very soul. I'm going to argue two things. So one, why these religious states are compatible with the basis of statehood and citizenship, and secondly, how this minimizes social conflict and promotes social cohesion, a generally more peaceful and stable world. Before that, I want to talk about the model. A few things to note. One, the motion does not exactly these states will be put up. We'll assume it will be consensual. We'll assume that there'll be adequate resources for people to sustain their way of life. Probably, we don't know how much land it'll get. It'll probably be proportionate to the needs of that specific religious group. Obviously, we don't, there are like blurry lines to what consists a different religion and simply a different sect. We think in those instances, the different sects can be proportioned land, and each sect given their own autonomy to determine according to their own rules. So like Protestants get some and Catholics get some, and they're all allowed to live according to their own legislation and whatever they want. We think the form of government of this is really specified, so we'll assume we leave it to the adherents of that religion to vote and decide what form of government they want. Crucially, this is not Israel, although it's somewhat similar. That's to say, we aren't going to intentionally put this in land that fosters conflict. Somewhat jokingly, we'll say an island will rise out of the Atlantic, and we'll put all these places there, just so we don't bind this to any particular part of the world. We don't think that's where the debate lies. It's about the principle of whether these states have a right to exist. So that leads me to my arguments. The first thing is I'm going to say is it's compatible with the basis of citizenship and of statehood. We have to ask, why do states exist if not for their people? We have to ask that and say that oftentimes a state exists to articulate a certain version of morality and make sure that the people who live within that state can live within that set of moral standards, right? So that's why when we talk about the Filipino, we have a sense of Filipino nationalism and a shared and common history. The incredible problem with status quo right now is that many people are not able to live out that sense of identity. That's to say, the concept of your religion is also inexorably called and codified with the concept of salvation. Let's say your eternal future for whatever based on where you live, how you live your life in this world. What does that mean? Your value of nationalism or your shared history towards your nation for many people, because like religion means oftentimes like more important than anything else in your life. It means that for a lot of people, the promise of nationalism is inadequate for them, and they lack a state that fully represents their interests. That's to say, if my religion adheres to pacifism, insofar as my state even has a military, I am constantly complicit by sending taxes to them to say that I am literally killing people and I will face damnation for that when I face God or whatever. We think then that means it forces people into an incredibly moralized, incredibly detrimental position. Furthermore, as we brought in the context earlier, the promise of secularism in order to live in a nice secular society together oftentimes demands incredibly bad things of people who are religious. As to say, in France, they banned rosaries and non-hajjats and hijabs from being worn in the public or being worn by public servants, which to a secular society may be an aspect of neutrality, but to someone who's religious may be an attack on my very identity, an attack on who I am in a very specific sense. These conflicts will always exist because people who are religious, who aren't religious, and belong to different religious groups have fundamental disagreements that cannot just be consensus or democracy or discourse away. Oftentimes we have distinct interests and we ought to be represented by distinct states, right? So insofar as we think Israel is a completely Jewish state, for example, we think at least the people in the majority of that state are able to exist in relative cohesion because they're able to debate on things fairly healthily. We think that means it's a right for the citizens to be represented by that single state. Second argument, how are we able to minimize conflict and promote social cohesion? A few incentive structures about what status quo looks like. Given that your commitment to religion for a lot of people is higher than your commitment to democracy, because sure, you want to live in a peaceful society and agree to the Lockean social contract or whatever we learn in our talk side classes. We also have a higher commitment that to say our God literally commands us to do these sorts of things. What does that mean? One, in many instances, discourse is bound to break down. That's to say, oftentimes you simply are not willing to compromise your moral positioning when you see someone who lives completely different from you. So for example, if we look at the concept of Sharia courts, it's completely different from a secular legal system because it intensely trying to protect and display different values. So the idea of your inheritance has to be done in a way that's very specific, otherwise it's immoral, versus your secular conception of how inheritance law should be. We think these are fundamentally incompatible. And we ultimately think that, like, relatively speaking, these are both morally valid ways to like think of things. Like, objectively speaking, who gets what land is fairly petty. We think we simply need to have a way for everyone to be able to live in consensus. How does this religious state allow us to, and also like a lot of people resort to violence, all those incentive structures that are literally no longer willing to engage in this. We talked about bombing abortion clinics. So what is the converse on our side? How are we able to be less violent and have more social cohesion? The first is moral debates within these religious states are going to happen on shared premises of morality. It's often going to be a question of interpreting a same religious text or interpreting the same command of God. So to the extent that there are still disagreements, at least they agree on the basic set of moral truths. That's to say, my priority is no longer the best interest of the state versus the best interest of the church, which are fundamentally irreconcilable and difficult to reconcile. At least now we have debates about, like, what does the Bible say about this, or what does the Hadith say about this. So those kinds of things are more likely to boost consensus. Why? One, there's a shared state of facts. But furthermore, if you look at our prop, the fact that you're allowing different sects to segregate themselves in that way means that at least even if differences aren't reconcilable, you can at the very least be sharing with more specific kinds of people. The other problem we think this fixes is it gets rid of like ugly land disputes. That's to say, because there are a lot of Muslims and Christians in this area, one state believes that it has the right to take claim and lay claim and invade that other country. Obviously, when you have the really religious people, you just give them a state for themselves. That massive infrastructure to like Deus Volt Deus Volt people, we think that massive incentive is massively reduced insofar as you're literally appeasing a lot of the demands of these people. Lastly, we think these states are probably not going to be rogue, so like they'll probably be required to join the ICC or the Rome Statute, so any kinds of abuse are probably going to be minimized there. Most countries do this just because it's religious. We don't see why it would be different. We think these are stable states, but just states for those who have been left behind by the promise of secularization and left behind by interreligious conflict. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that speech and welcome the Leader of the Opposition to continue their team's case. And per Sherm's suggestion, I will sit up.
Is this good? Am I audible? Panel, the entirety of the speech that you heard from the Prime Minister assumes that the most important thing in every individual's lives is religion. Insofar as we'll prove in our speech that not only is this not significantly hurt by the status quo, but the ability of you to practice religion in every other part of your life is hurt by this particular policy, I think we'll take this debate. I want to deal with the premise of his case first. The claim that religion is heavily oppressed in secularity. Clearly, I don't need to defend a world in which particular religions are oppressed under the name of secularity, as per France and the Burqa ban. What I think we can stand for on our side is a world in status quo that pushes for maximizing personal choice of each and every individual. So for example, i.e. the bar is generally your life can go on as per your religion. We're happy to say you should be allowed to wear the burqa or the hijab as per the majority of countries around the world. We're happy to say that this bar stops at the point of abortion because that affects someone else's life rather than yours. I don't think this is a particularly oppressive bar because it ensures that you as an individual are able to live the religious life that you want. But also note that the argument on that side is unlikely to have a significant effect, especially in the long term. The reason for that is that statistically, the world shows a significant trend away from religiosity in a world where the numbers of people who claim to be Christian, numbers of people who claim to be Buddhist are falling for all major religions around the world, especially within the developed world. I.e., I think what they do is that they push a policy where it's unclear the relevance of the harm that they're premising it on in the future. To the degree, two arguments, the rest of my responses will be integrated. The first thing I want to ask is, I want to prove that religion becomes more oppressive The second I want to prove is that religion as a premise of power is fundamentally bad. And the third thing I'll prove is that to the degree that religion may have benefits such as solace, they lose it on that side. First, on why religion becomes more oppressive. The core argument that they have against this is this idea of the principle of statehood that they claim people should opt into. Note that they don't actually have a choice on that side of the house because this policy presumably exists independent of whether people wanted this policy to take place. There are two things to note here. The first is that this assumes that religion is the primary driver of every part of their life, including the economy, etc., which is incredibly unlikely, which is not necessarily the case, and they haven't proven is the case. But secondly, I think the reality is that on that side, the extent of choice people have is whether they are religious or not. They are forced into maximum religiosity or no religiosity whatsoever, which is not a choice that I think people are comfortable making in the status quo. Forcing them into this choice is a bad thing, insofar as it removes their agency to determine whether they want to be religious in the first place. I think the reason why the right to choice over religion is important is twofold. First, it controls your thought. Literally no other method, no other creed in society claims the ability to police your thoughts and tell you a bad person just for the things you think rather than your actions. But insofar as actions are concerned, every part of how you lead your life is generally going to be factored in by religion. Your personal actions often are religiously condemned or religiously approved, and therefore the ability to choose religion is incredibly important. We think that agency requires the ability to opt in, which they lose. But I think the second thing they lose is the ability of people to opt out. No, thank you. The reason why this is important is many people who are born religious and even live in religious societies tend to change their views on religion. In the status quo, I think the world has moved towards one that is increasingly easy to change your religion. Things like the decrease of religion with generations. The fact that it doesn't have a significant effect on your ability to be, on your public persona in terms of your job, for instance, or your ability to make friends. Things like the fact that access to alternatives often exists for the majority of people in the world who live in urban areas mean that we have developed a world where the pernicious and oppressive and coercive nature of religion has been minimized to a large degree. This is different on that side of the house because now in order to change your religion, you have to leave the country. That's something that is incredibly privileged and only a very small subsection of people can do. So they lock people into religion. They lock people into the birth lottery that people may not want to be locked into. I think that's a bad thing. Second, I think a common refuge to the oppressive nature of religion is the freedom to self-define. That is structurally less likely to exist in a world where the country bases itself on religion. Think about how nationalist some countries can be in the status quo. There's certain things like a stiff British upper lip are considered integral to being a Brit. This changes at a point that this similarly exists in a religious country. That's why at a point that religious authorities claim the ability to make law, that means and claim the basis of your belonging in that country upon your religion. That means the extent of vitriol you have for self-defining and choosing to follow some parts of religion and not others is significantly decreased on that side of the house. That means that individuals lose the ability to define religion for themselves. Insofar as religion is a way of life, I think that's integral to religion having any benefit whatsoever. But third, dealing with this idea of common ground on that side, note that religions often have different interpretations in the status quo. That's okay, because in the status quo, when we restrict people to personal lives, whether or not a majority of other people opt into your religion has no impact on you for the majority of moderate followers of religion. That changes on that side of the house, because at the point that it becomes state policy, this necessitates conflicts which are more often not incredibly difficult to solve between different sects of religion, for example. Look at Islam, not just the Sunni Shia divide, but the fact that Islam structurally doesn't give you clear instructions on what can and cannot be done, but rather guidelines that are open to interpretation. These interpretations are likely to get significantly bloodier and significantly more cause significantly more tension on that side of the house. The comparative is that appeal to secularism moves us towards actual common ground in terms of things like economic policy, common bars like what kind of rights you have and why you shouldn't overstep these rights. And it's critical to being able to create change, or to be able to create agreement within society. So we think religion becomes more oppressive on that side of the house. I want to continue on with this argument of why religion is a bad premise of power. I think the problem on that side of the house is that insofar as some issues are non-religious, they lose the ability for you to have meaningful discussion on these things. The reason for that is that religions are just structurally undemocratic. Look at nobody votes for the imams, nobody votes for very few people vote for the Pope, and that's just likely to translate into a society because the premise of religion is seconding the idea of right and wrong to a higher being, because that higher being is supposed to be able to give you solace. That higher being is supposed to be more all-knowing than you as a random individual. The problem, therefore, is that on that side of the house, other things that are non-religious, like democracy, tend towards this appeal to religion because of the fact that the people at the top claim both an authority from their leadership, but also an authority from their religious nature. That means that all of these other issues, you just lack the ability to challenge them because they claim themselves to be a leader. And the more OG says that this is all of your life, the more this argument is going to hold true because the bar between religion and actual policy becomes thinner and thinner. The final thing I want to justify is this idea of why religion is not going to give you solace on our side. There are two things to note. The first is that at the point that religion becomes your entire life, it is harder and harder for you to use religion as an escape from the pain of your daily life, the economic struggles that you face, for example. You can't treat church as an alternate world where it's not hurtful to you, where you're not affected by this policy, because that same church is what determined that policy. And that hurts the ability of people in the lives that they think are shit and painful to feel some kind of solace and feel some kind of comfort in society. We are happy to propose.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for that speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue their team's case.
Am I audible? Is this volume okay? Okay, great. The first thing I want to do away with is this assumption from the previous speaker that we are forcing people to move into these religious states, that they will totally have to assume that religion is at the forefront of every decision that they make. Number one, I don't think that is the way by which we are implementing this model. We are not forcing people to move to these countries in the same way that this debate is not about people who don't feel strongly about their religious beliefs or people who feel that their religious beliefs can be compromised with other secular beliefs or other people's religious beliefs. So crucially, this is a debate about people who feel that their religion crucially dictates every decision they make, both in the political, social, and economic level. I think my partner gave an excellent example how in a secular state, you can be forced to pay taxes, and those taxes might go into funding abortion or might go into funding the legalization of same-sex marriage, which, while this is not a debate about whether those things are objectively moral, for the life of a person who is religious, that is an immoral action and it will likely harm your chances of achieving eternal salvation. We think that is extremely unfair. Secondly, he says, well, religiosity is going down. Again, we think that's irrelevant to this debate. If not, I think that just proves the increasing level of isolation that religious people experience in an increasingly non-religious world, which means that for more often than not, we have people who are pushing atheism or agnosticism as the new standard or ideal that people should abide. It is not, again, an objective examination of which is better, but just the fact that people should be able to live their lives how they deem it to ultimately be so. So I don't think that's relevant. Next, I want to rebut his idea about there being common ground among different interpretations of people who follow that religion. Number one, even if it's true that different religions can coexist because they might have different interpretations, that doesn't change the fact that interpretations cannot affect your dogma, which means that even if I, as a religious person, can coexist with a person who's non-religious because I can change my interpretation of the Bible, that doesn't change the fact that the dogma says that I shouldn't support things like abortion or that I shouldn't support things like same-sex marriage. And those things will crucially not change or are incredibly unlikely to change in the world of status quo. Secondly, I think we told you how sex can still be given administrative autonomy even within the same mass of land, which means that while the dogma is the same, different sects can follow specific nuances to their faith that they can adopt within their own nation. I think this is a fairer world in comparison to the world of status quo, where they literally have to negotiate political debates, which will ultimately lead to very little compromise and just far more conflict in the world of status quo. I think lastly, even in the worst case scenario that there might be some differences that are crucial because a person from a different sect might become the state leader, we think that is unlikely to lead to a massive harm because the likely scenario is you still have a predominant belief that is shared among the vast majority of people. So we think the harm comparatively is less in that world compared to status quo, where you are literally debating against millions of other people who can have thousands of different viewpoints compared to yours. So I think that effectively deals with the case of opening of the previous speaker. So I want to show you, and this will be directly respond to the best case scenario of the previous slide. I will show you why even if religions do shape political institutions, we think that is a moral and a legitimate choice that they should be given in the life of a religious person. So I don't think there was much response from the previous speaker about the basis for forming states and the basis for understanding what the nation should be about. We told you why there's a shared identity that's deeply profound and is most likely to be permanent. Note, we do not have to prove absolute permanence in the sense that even citizens of states today can have an allegiance to a country that is not permanent, the fact that they can choose to leave, or that they can have varying degrees of loyalty to their state. We also don't have to prove that religion is immutable in the sense that people can choose to leave their religion. Maybe in one day they have some ultimate profound realization and they decide that they want to leave religions. We allow them to leave their states. But what's ultimately essential to consider in this debate is that a person's conception of morality can be largely founded on their religion, and that ultimately shapes the way they view social, economic, and political institutions. So for example, values on how women should wear, or values about Sharia court, which tend to deviate from typical criminal justice systems. What happens in status quo is you are always forced to compromise and to give up parts of your identity because you are forced to coexist with other people who have fundamentally different values as yours. And secondly, I think what they forget is that religion is very important to a certain group of people. These are people who feel that their history is largely defined by their religion. So the fact that you can have people, for example, people who belong to Islam in the Philippines who feel that their history is about having been excluded on the basis of their religion. So I think it's grossly wrong for the previous speaker to assume those things are largely separate. I think ultimately what we give people in government side is a choice, the choice for them to avoid having to make the moral trade-off about living with other people where they can fundamentally not convince them to support their religion and where they're not forced to make decisions which sacrifice their salvation and sacrifice whether or not you're going to heaven. I think ultimately we make it fair for everyone. I think this is a better world. But secondly, I'll show you why even in the worst case that conflict can still ensue, why we think the risk is significantly higher in status quo. My partner told you why secularism is difficult to implement. What he will say is that number one, the reason why conflict is less likely is because you reduce the chances of microaggressions, which often form the basis by antagonistic groups of people to justify prejudices against the other. So for example, even if you could have some level of social cohesion, that doesn't change the fact that you will often experience microaggressions simply because people do not share the same lives as you. I think secondly, inevitably, you will have people from religions who want to rise into power because they want to shape political institutions. What we do is minimize the harm that they can inflict because at least they're doing it to people who share the same values as them. POI from opposition, yes.
Doesn't everything you say about being able to leave in the status quo knife the uniqueness of your proposition? In the status quo, if someone doesn't like the way their government dictates certain religious policies, they can move to another country where that country does have that religious opportunity. You don't uniquely add anything.
Well, how does that not uniquely add anything? It gives them the ability to live life without conflict or with a lesser degree of conflict because they can now vote or decide where their taxes go to. I think that's a value in and of itself, that I don't have to commit another sin which harms my chances of salvation. I think that's incredibly myopic and limited view coming from the opposition bench, right? So I think every decision that a religious person makes literally counts to whether or not they're going to heaven. That is a unique value that is constantly compromised in the world of opposition bench. Secondly, what we think is that even if, let's say, opposition might say you can still engage in international conflict, maybe you want to engage in war, we think at the very least, the threshold for international aggression is significantly less in our world because number one, you'll need to amass a larger amount of resources to send troops across the sea or across land. It is far more likely to merit international condemnation when you are inflicting conflict from people who belong to a different state compared to people who belong within your own country. So even in the worst case scenario, we think the harms of that are significantly less. Our world gives choice. Our world minimizes conflict. Vote for opening government. Thanks.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech and welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close the opening half.
Sorry, can you all hear me? I want to note that the opening government cedes much of their principle at the point where they concede that smaller sects are now likely to live within the larger majority within that religion. Because this means on their side as well that many of these individuals who are likely to be the most vulnerable individuals, even in status quo, are likely to also have to give up much of their practices in order to suit the majority of individuals that have far different practices. That even within religions themselves, they can have distinctly different practices and different ideas of how a religion should be practiced. Insofar as that's the case, the unique benefit that status quo and opposition allows you is the power of neutrality and its ability to keep everyone safe regardless of how different and how unique they are. This is something that is not present within the opening government case. I think there are two assumptions that the opening government case makes that I don't think they prove. The first is they need to prove that they are willing to engage that these individuals are willing to engage in a world where they have a maximum or a far higher degree of religion that is going to be imposed on them. Secondly, they need to prove that these individuals are likely to want to continue to be under that religion. Insofar as the world is one that is not static, insofar as people, as Sean points out to you, change all the time, insofar as you're likely to get new individuals within this state that are unlikely to be able to leave these states easily, right? I think to recognize that the bulk of opening government's response to us is to say, well, if you're not happy at the point where you move over, then you don't have to care anymore. I think this ignores the reality that it's oftentimes very hard for individuals who have already moved over or individuals who were born in those instances to be able to extricate themselves at the point where they've already put them down roots, at the point where the last 18 years of your life was spent established in that country, that your economic development and your financial stability is oftentimes tied directly to that religious state, and you have no ability to extricate yourself from those instances. I think it's more important to recognize here, and I think Sean starts by pointing out to you, that it's unclear if individuals are even going to continue caring about their religion in the first place, or whether religion is as important as these people posit. The reality is that in status quo, religion only seems important in the first place, and the fact that religion seems important in the first place is a fallacy that is built off a lie, right? The reason that religion seems so important right now is because you get solace from it. You use religion as a form of solace from your current day-to-day life that's oftentimes depressing and sad for you. The reality is that day-to-day life, as Sean points out to you, doesn't change. And religion oftentimes therefore serves as a solace because it gives you some sort of meaning outside of the capitalist structure or capitalistic society that might seem too random for you to be able to understand. The problem is this, right? That if we recognize that these are structures that are unlikely to change, that a religious state is ultimately still a state that needs to have economic structures and financial institutions, they are often likely to follow the same sort of patterns insofar as competition in the global economy is a thing. This means that individuals are likely to suffer under these things as well. The difference is this, right? That in a world in which your religion is not tied to your state and not tied to your country, you have the ability to pick when you want to access that religious part of your identity. And the reality is this, right? That the vast majority of individuals don't solely have a religious identity, but care about things outside of their religious identity, right? That's why the vast majority of us continue to enjoy good lives outside, even in a neutral world in which your religion might not be the most important thing, or might not be the most valuable thing there. I think that's the difference, right? That the neutrality allows you to pick and choose on days where you decide that your religion might be important to you or might be less important or less useful to you when you want to access the different parts of your identity. A world in which you choose to lock yourself into a religious state, or a world in which you naturally move towards religious states and individuals are forced to choose between having no religion at all or like full religion, is one that is extremely oppressive for many of these individuals and just doesn't give you any sort of reasonable agency there. The problem with the GAF is that it forces religiosity to be the constant forefront that you deal with at every single point in your life from which you have no actual escape. And I think that's problematic for the vast majority of individuals who probably want a bit more agency, a bit more ability to live different parts of your life, right? There are times where I just don't want to live, like to wear the hijab, for instance, even if I'm a super religious and hyper-religious person. There are times where I just want to be free alone and to do the things that matter to me and the things that I want. Secondly, Sean tells you that oftentimes it's incredibly hard, as I pointed out earlier, for you to leave your religion. This deals, I think, with the large bulk of the responses coming from OG and establishes why I think the oppression is severely destructive at this point in time. But the last thing is this, right? The last thing that opening attempts to hold on to is to say, aha, but like now you are better able to practice these niche religions. I started off this speech by suggesting to you that niche religions were likely to suffer the same fate under a majority religious state as well. But I think the point here is this, right? That big religions are not a part of this debate insofar as they are always going to benefit from some degree of state influence or less important in this debate. Relatively, comparatively, it's these small religions which have less numbers and smaller economies, they are unlikely to survive in a world where every single religion is split up into a different state. Because this means they now have far less people, far less talent, and far less resources to be able to enact the sort of change that's necessary, to be able to enact the sort of stable governmental structures and economies that enable them to survive in the first place. This is precisely a world in which these individuals have no choice but to assimilate themselves into a larger economy, because this is a world in which almost every state is likely to be religious to some extent or another. But I think the last thing I want to deal with here is this, right? I'm going to suggest to you that even if we acknowledge buying OG at its best, that this is a debate about how we enable individuals to best access their religion, I suggest it's far worse on their side of the house. And I'll begin from a very simple premise. The premise here, I think, is that a world in which now your religiosity or your religion also happens to be your state authority or the individuals that are likely to run the state, insofar as they are likely to be the people that are representative of you. This means that you now pack the concept of religiosity to very tangible metrics and KPIs that can easily be called out. Because the state needs to care about things other than religion, right? The state needs to care about things like your economy, it needs to care about things like your GDP, for instance. And I think that are very tangible and numerical in nature. They are things that are commonly compared across different countries and are likely to be weighed out very easily across different countries by virtue of the numerical nature of it. This means that This means, firstly, that it gives states and different countries a very clear point and a very clear metric to decide whether or not your country is doing well, whether or not your country is working well, and a very clear point on which other states can attack you in many of these instances, right? This means here that the debate literally becomes a constant question of where is your God now and what has your God done for you? And I think that severely hurts the ability of individuals to be able to access any sort of religiosity, right? Because this means currently that the tangible life that you currently lead right now, the fact that you now have no job, or the fact that you now have no money, is not something that you can ascribe to another individual or another institution and go to religion and get solace from. It's a world in which the religion has directly failed you and has failed to carry out many of its duties. There is only so far that religions can go on and say, haha, this is a war that we need to continue fighting, people, let's continue fighting and strive really, really hard, right? That at some point individuals are going to realize that there's no capacity to be able to achieve the aim that is promised these individuals. And it makes it very hard for individuals to be able to reconcile the promises that a religion oftentimes promises them, right? The fact that they are going to live a good life, the fact that life is going to be significantly better here, or the fact that they were promised that their lives are going to be far better at the point when they move over to this new religious state. And it hurt the ability of individuals to therefore find the same sort of solace and religiosity that they would otherwise have. But the second is this, right? That it also creates far more tension within global states and the global, the geopolitical, factions, right? Is to realize now there is actually a tangible and substantial reason for expansion. If you realize that things like proselytization and expansion of religion already becomes a strong and problematic force that exists in status quo, this becomes far worse. Because this is now a world in which the number of people you have, the number of people under your religion, directly affects your manpower in your global economy, for instance, and gives individuals a clear incentive to fight and target other religions and to call other religions. This is a world in which religion is actually under attack, and individuals have no ability to protect themselves, neither do states.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that speech and welcome the government member to begin their team's case.
I think that OG is all about taking themselves out of the debate by being so wishy-washy, and OO is the same by having a truly bizarre conception of the model ought to be. Here's why our extension uniquely wins the debate and is by far the most important contribution. The first reason is because our contribution about refugees, migrants, and those truly in need of somewhere to go and to offer them citizenship is something that turns the kind of kumbaya people live in happiness and harmony kind of vague and ambiguous characterization in case of side OG into something that's quantified and truly important. And because our second extension that explains why not only people who leave countries, but who remain in those countries have better lives. Okay, getting into it then. First argument is going to be about refugees. So I think that we have this motion as a potential to save thousands of lives and lift the suffering of millions. Three layers, first of all. The first is the status quo. Lots of people have to escape war, climate change, other disasters. They have a choice to either wait for ages to the chance to become for refugee status in the US or something, or because their conditions are so unimaginably bad, they're willing to do things such as to risk their lives in order to sneak into European countries who have their borders closed to them. And even if they succeed in entering without dying, they are forced to enter without citizenship and survive on the meager amounts that they're given as refugees. I think that this obviously leads to a huge degree of suffering. That is to say, either you die on the way, which I think is a very, very real problem because they are forced to try and sneak in through dangerous routes in order to avoid detection by a government that would send them right fight back, but also just the degree of humiliation and exploitation they might have to go through to find illegal work to be seen as an outcast is unimaginable. Well, and before the other side says, oh, we don't obviously have to defend this kind of bad government, here are some structural reasons why the governments of Europe will never become any better. 3 reasons. The first is because the majority of these these countries are obviously still Caucasian or Christian, or identify as something like or original French people, for example, who see themselves as different from these refugees. They perceive them as an out group, and I think that they're scapegoated for things such as the failure of the welfare state or for economic suffering, because they're seen as leeches, for example. As such, it's politically suicide for any party to decide to pass major laws allowing refugees to enter and giving them better conditions. But also, I just think that another reason is because integration has to a large degree failed in these countries. They're perceived as dangerous. They're going to be excluded by people, even if by some miracle the government changes its actions. Why is our comparative so great? So 3 reasons why the creation of these states makes life so much better for these people. First of all, because obviously there's now no need to sneak in, because you don't have to go through dangerous routes because you're smuggled in that cost so many lives. This is perhaps unique to the creation of religious states, because these are states which will unconditionally grant you citizenship if you show yourself to be of the same religion as that state. But second of all, you also have citizenship, and therefore you're able to work, right? And that's hugely important, being to improve your own living situation, live a decently dignified life. But third of all, I also think that the government because the government's constituency has a broadly values the principle of loving your fellow neighbors, especially loving other people who are of the same religion. There's going to be a high degree of support, not only from communities such as your local mosque or local church, but also a high degree of support from your government, which has an endowed responsibility to care for people within its borders. But fourthly, I also think that it delivers a feeling of belonging, because this is the point at which there's an emphasis on your fitting in there, you're having a place in that country, and on basically everyone having a strong belief that it's important to care for your neighbors, for example. Here's a reason why these states will likely have the capacity to do all of this for them. For example, ship or transport people from the original countries to their countries. I think the model is sufficient to assume that the state is not only an existing state, but a functional state with a non-insignificant amount of funding. But I also think that they're going to receive a significant degree of support from other actors. For example, if it's from religious countries, for example, Saudi Arabia and Indonesia, who want to expand their soft power influence and build allies, or reinforce their legitimacy in the eyes of their public as being good Muslim governments, for example, but also just things from incredibly wealthy actors such as the Catholic Church. The significance of this argument is manifold. Obviously, we relieve the immensely profound suffering of many people who risk their lives on the route to countries, and the suffering that they go through because they are not given citizenship there. I think this is true not only of people from war zones, but also those who are persecuted and killed because of their religion, think they're Rohingya, giving them this haven would save a huge number of their lives because they can't stay where they are. I also think that's really great for, it's important because the urgency of this will increase significantly because of climate refugees, and beyond this, it allows many people to form uniquely fulfilling lives, because even if their countries are able to accept them and allow them to become citizens, they're unlikely to be able to do things such as support themselves to the same extent, to feel the same kind of spiritual fulfillment, and be able to create a life from the ground up for themselves. This is also true for economic migrants who are not refugees, who come from instead very, very, very poor nations, and instead go to these new countries that are more likely to be richer because there's a blend of people from wealthy countries and poorer countries. Okay, so obviously we have the most important impact on this round. Now to why we make life significantly better for these minorities who don't choose to move too. I think that at the point at which we reduce the number of refugees going into European countries, you also reduce the perception of leeches who are overwhelming the welfare system. I also think we should consider who it is going to these countries. They're either those who are extremely desperate and who have to go to Europe, but also they're likely to be extremely desperate, but also likely to be people who feel really, really strong about their religion. For example, people who are relatively radical. These, a percentage of these are those who create things such as parallel legal systems within foreign countries, or even are willing to go as far as to do things such as commit crime or terrorism, because they feel as though their religion is being crushed and they're living in a world that is immensely immoral within their foreign country. I think at the point at which they move into a religious country where they feel like even if the people around them aren't radical enough that their fellow Muslims they ought not kill, or that I think that this is the point at which you also decrease the number of cases of terrorism. This is important because even if this is really, really uncommon and only in actions of some radicals, they're really, really high
Okay, this is important because it allows narratives such as these immigrants are just as German as you are to gain traction. This is great because it decreases the rise of far-right political parties that have the ability to set countries' diversity and acceptance back by decades, but also do things such as increase hate crimes to just allow immigrants to feel more accepted and like they live in an equal opportunity society to a far greater extent. For these reasons, we are truly delivering the most important impacts in this round, not just something statehood, but about saving thousands of lives. This is what we're talking about. I think it's clear that you have to go to team closing government.
I'd like to thank the government member for that speech and welcome the opposition member to continue their team's case. Open their team's case.
All right, can you guys hear me okay? Sorry, was that a yes? Perfect. Okay, all right. Closing opposition is going to win this debate by providing you the decision-making criteria for when we create states, and secondly, to show how this policy hurts more religious people as well as non-religious at a large macro scale. Now, first, to engage with closing government's ridiculous extension. First of all, if they're so concerned with refugees, why don't we just fiat all of the money that they would use to create this state to just improve refugee-specific programs, right? There's no unique reason why it has to be a religious state in order to be able to do this. We could use this money more targeted for refugees if that was the case, and thus you wouldn't want to support this policy. Secondly, many of these refugees don't necessarily want this. They're presuming that a majority of refugees want to be relocated into a religious state. When I doubt that's the case, I'm sure many of them would probably prefer to go to like America or Australia, where they can like mine more like decades of economic opportunity. Third, it's a ridiculous case because many religious minorities who are refugees are being persecuted by the religious majority. And as per the model that came from OG, you would thus be sending them back to a country where their religious majority now lives, which means you are literally putting them back into the fire to be persecuted by the religious majority who doesn't like this religious minority. Lastly, and just most importantly, like a lot of refugees aren't religious. And so like this policy also doesn't solve for a significant amount of refugees who won't be solved by religious relocation. Now, when do we create states and why has government across the board not met this criteria, right? Opening government knifes themselves when they acknowledge that lots of people in states have intense views that don't agree with the government, right? The prime minister himself says, what about pacifists, right? Who don't agree with military usage? This is the exact reason why we have lots of different people who have lots of different ideas, many of them non-religious, and we don't just magically create states whenever someone disagrees with a government decision, right? Because it's unfeasible. You have no fair way of choosing between all these different belief systems, and it also just doesn't make practical sense in the world in terms of having a limited amount of land and a limited amount of states, right? We see in the status quo that we have made exceptions for this in the past when there was an acute harm for certain groups, such as the creation of Israel following like World War II genocide of Jewish people, right? But I don't think that this criteria applies here because there's no acute harm for religious individuals. And I'm gonna give you a couple of reasons why. One, and unfortunately the DPN just didn't respond to my POI, in the status quo, if Sharia law is so important to you, you can just move to a country where there is Sharia law. And this solves for a lot of what the DPN was so concerned about. Second of all, you still have lots of private options to engage with your community. You can send your kids to like religious school. They can have religious jobs, like work in like a Mormon book factory, right? There are ways in which you can remain in your community in the status quo. Thirdly, you have like, even if we buy this idea that like they're becoming more and more isolated in an increasingly secular world, you also have tools in this increasingly globalized world to stay connected. You have like Facebook groups, and you can have like Zoom calls, literally, to have like online congregations. So it actually doesn't matter how individually isolated you are because you have technological access to religious people all over the world. And so then lastly, as a result of all of this, they failed to give us a criteria of why religious people are the one minority group in our country who deserve a state creation for them. I don't think that there's any acute harm here, and I think that actually any harms that they talked about are largely non-existent. Secondly, why is this policy likely to create more harms for both religious people and non-religious people alike? First of all, in terms of the state itself, right? OO mentioned how institutionalized religion will become magnified in such states. right? Like you like put your belief in a higher power. Things are a little bit less democratic. Yeah, that's true. Not really impacted out. What's more important though is that in these religious states where institutionalized religion is now magnified, you're less critical of oppression or abuse in general, which is why you see such pernicious child sex abuse scandals within the institutionalized Christian religion and the Vatican, for example. And this is something that they have dealt with for decades and they've been unable to deal with because of the ways in which priests are able to abuse their power position in order to be able to take advantage of their constituents or their like the people within their congregation, right? So actually what government is now proposing is to aggregate all of these priests, aggregate all of these people who view themselves as like representing God, and now sitting them in seats of power within this new religious state, which gives them more ability to abuse, more ability to oppress people, and creates a situation where people are even less likely to critique those in those situations of power, right? So I think those states are much more likely to suffer from pernicious abuse that goes unreported and is institutionally supported. Secondly, in terms of the state itself, the motion says for all who profess to believe in this religion, but this is not something you can really verify, right? Anybody can claim to be a part of this religion and thus go to this state, which means that the state is always going to have a certain level of suspicion where everyone in that state believes, like, Bolo, is your family really Christian? Or are you guys fake Christian? You just wanted to move here because you thought there'd be better economic opportunity, right? And this is particularly high risk because as per the motion, you gain citizenship based on professing to this religion. So if people find out that you don't actually profess this religion, you will lose your citizenship, right? So it means that lots of people are always going to be suspicious of each other. The state is going to be less communal. People are going to trust each other less if there are people who like faked their way into it. But here's the thing, even if people didn't actually fake their way into it, the possibility that people could have means that this suspicion and aggression towards each other will always exist. But a more pernicious level of this that Oh mentioned but didn't impact out or explain is this idea of like, your preferences can change, but if your religious belief is linked to your citizenship, it means that you could become non-religious like I did when I grew up. But if you cannot afford to leave that religious country you were born in, you are now stuck in that country as a non-citizen, which means you cannot afford to leave, but you now have less rights as a non-citizen because your citizenship was contingent on your religious beliefs. We think this is a huge harm for people who naturally change their abilities, right? On a more macro level though, and this is my second extension, polarization, right? I think that for religious people who are left behind or who are not able to move to this state, there's a variety of different harms. One, not all of them are going to be able to afford to go to this new religious state. Two, not all of them are necessarily going to want to go. And so what that means is that it polarizes and increases the divide of those who are left behind, because when they disagree with things that their secular state is doing, now the secular people in that state have an excuse to say, well, just go home then. Go back to your like Christian state that we like literally perfectly made for you. And so I think that people will be less tolerant towards religious people that are less behind. They'll receive less funding. There's more likely to be hate crimes because people view them as like less and less a part of your state because they could just go to their own religious state if they wanted to, right? So it's all the things that OG complained about in the status quo, but worse. Secondly, we think that these countries ultimately lose the mixing pot of having lots of different religions in them, all right? So like in America or other large secular countries, you see that there's so many different religions in there, and it's only by growing up with other people around you. You go to school with like Islamic kids, even though you're Christian, right? You learn more about these religions. It's only by exposure that you become more tolerant. So if government is so concerned with tolerance and increasing discrimination against religious people, they're making this far worse by removing the amount of interactions or lessening the amount of interactions that people have. So assuming that a somewhat significant amount of people do choose to go to this religious state, that's a proportionally less amount of interaction that they're having with secular people around the world, and secular people thus have no incentive or no way to become more tolerant of religious people. Lastly, just like at international relations level, I think these countries are likely to compete with each other because they'll view themselves as like, oh, there's only limited religious states, right? Like the Jewish state is going to compete with Israel, right? I think that like the Islamic state will compete with Iran. And so it creates more polarization on an international affairs level and less compromise, right? So I think ultimately government doesn't justify why we should create a state. I think that most of their harms are non-unique. I think that we've given you the most significant micro level harms about abuse and non-citizenship within the state, and we've given you more macro level harms, which brings us above in terms of polarization across the globe. Very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition member for that speech and welcome the government whip to conclude the government portion of today's debate.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to make one thing very clear at the top of my speech, which is that the motion itself specifies that if you are part of a particular religion, that they offer you citizenship. the offer is not conditional, obviously. And after you accept the offer, retaining the offer is obviously also not conditional on constantly proving you are religious, right? And what that obviously then means is most of CO's arguments fall out of the debate of you feeling like if you aren't part of religion anymore, suddenly becoming stateless. Secondly, that there are also states that will still exist on either side of the house that are presumably secular. If that is the case, given that is a scenario, that people could likely move to those areas anyways. Given that, I want to talk about three things in my speech. Firstly, choice. Secondly, on inter-religion relationships. And finally, on life within these countries. So firstly, let's talk about the notion of choice, largely dealing with opening house. I think all of OO's trade-offs of choice pertain specifically to religion, despite the fact that they pointed out religion is not the only thing that matters to individuals. And I think we agree with that. Religion isn't the most important component of many people's lives. But in the status quo, the very label of a particular religious identity excludes people from far more important basic choices. Choices like the ability to choose your home. Choices like the ability to live a good life without fearing death in civil wars resulting from conflict. The choice to be able to have a stable life and choose your job legally. These are choices that are denied to millions of people, right? Right now, there are millions of religious refugees, stateless groups, and persecuted religious minorities who have nowhere to turn. And this is a big impact, right? Let's just characterize it a little bit. This includes the Rohingya Muslims who are currently being persecuted for genocide. This includes the Palestinians who are dying, starving every day on the West Bank. This includes the Kurds who every day are suffering from terrorist attacks and being killed off because they have nowhere to go and being persecuted in Turkey. This includes the millions of people streaming out of places like war-torn Syria and also people who are suffering from climate change and who have nowhere to go. To be clear, these people are being denied citizenship around the world to enter some of the biggest countries like the United States and Europe. We say that this particular policy is one that simply gives them safety. It gives them a safe haven, it gives them a state so they can actually live a good life. That is the biggest impact. We already win it by default. What were CO's feeble responses? The first thing they said was, well, let's just re-divest all the money it takes to fiat this and then channel it to making states exclusively for refugees. The first thing to know is that this debate isn't about a money pot. It's about the creation of a functional state. And I would argue that on their side of the house, if you made a state exclusively for refugees, that probably isn't a very economically tantalizing state, and that many people wouldn't move into that state, obviously, because it's filled with refugees with no skills and no capital. Doesn't make much sense. The second response they said was, well, some people don't want to go to certain countries, right? Well, given this is the case, these people obviously have other alternatives that they don't want to go. Like, we're not forcing them into it, right? It's obviously a choice. But I would say most people would still choose this choice over the choice of being stateless, of having nowhere to go, being in some random amorphous like limbo of not knowing where your life is going to end up. Then the third thing they said is that you're actually going to send all these people back into the melting pot because you're sending them back to their own religious communities that are currently persecuting them. Presumably, the people that are persecuting these religious groups are persecuting them because they have heretic beliefs, because they are of a different sect, CF, in like Burma, for instance. The Burmese have a very different belief in like Buddhism as compared to the Rohingya Muslims, and that's precisely the reason why they're being persecuted. They're different religions. It doesn't make any sense. And also, this is an opt-in policy. I don't think many people would logically opt into being persecuted, so it doesn't make much sense either, right? So given this, I think this already wins the round almost by default. But let's compare it anyways to what OO tells us. OO basically says, number one, you lose the ability to choose your religion. I would argue two things. The first one is the response I already gave you, right? This isn't the most important choice as they identified. But number two, that they've not shown why this is a meaningful or important or impactful choice in any particular way, or how this choice already exists to a meaningful extent on their side of the house. I would argue that in the vast majority of cases, people are born in communities that already determine their religious affiliation in the long run. If they want to pin their case on the fact that you somehow change your religious beliefs overnight, like sometime in the future when you're very old or whatever, I would argue it's still like one, possible on our side of the house, given like how globalized the world is and the fact that like there's internet and stuff, and two, the fact that like and two, the fact that like this can obviously happen. The second thing they said is you lose the ability to self-interpret religion because you hand it over to a large, big institution. I would say two things. The first one is that we contest the ability for individuals to already do this autonomously in the status quo, where most people are already born in very hierarchical communities where they look to their local parish or their local commune as to how to interpret religion. But the second one is, I would argue that the choice of opting into a state is one that requires people to very rigorously interrogate their own beliefs about religion, right? Interrogating how exactly they feel, whether or not they're willing to make the choice, and that's all very important. Why do we outweigh OG in terms of the choice mechanism? I would argue that this policy does occur on the extremes and on the margins. Yes, religion shapes your morals, but obviously most Christians aren't keeping heaven and hell in their mind at all times. Those who are most likely to move, and those who have the greatest change in the quality of life when they move, are those coming from no state at all, and those are the people we talk about specifically on our side. We win that clash in terms of the choice we offer to those who are most vulnerable. Secondly, I'll talk about interreligion relationships. We gave you three crucial pieces of analysis. Number one, we told you that states become actually far more tolerant, right? And the reason why is because many states right now are open to religious groups and religious minorities, but they often have not in my backyard syndrome, where they don't want to see them firsthand leeching off their own state, where they're amenable to seeing them in the abstract, but when they're on their doorsteps, they're unwilling to give them handouts from their own hard-earned cash. And this directly responds to CO when they say that you inspire hateful rhetoric. I would argue hateful rhetoric is more likely on your side of the house when these people are seen as leeches on the government, when these people are seen as unproductive, and they're seen as big threats to terrorist groups and things like that. On our side, I would argue actually decrease that, you actually de-escalate those tensions when people aren't so close together. But the second one is we reduce persecution. Here's the thing important to know. One important reason why people become extreme, why they turn to extremist sects, is because there's lots of persecution of their particular group, so they have no one else to turn to, they feel isolated. We reduce that when people can move into communities where they are accepted, so we reduce terrorism, right? That's a vast impact, which is hugely important on our side of the house. Thirdly, we de-escalate lots of catalysts of conflict, i.e. the desire to have your own land, to start civil wars and things like that. We de-escalate all of that. I would say that conflict on a vast scale goes down dramatically. Finally then, let's talk about life within these particular countries. OO says that these countries will be undemocratic and oppressive no matter what. There are two reasons why this is not the case. The first one is empirically false, right? States like Iran are democracies. They are states that have, and like they're actually rated pretty highly on democracy scales compared to states like the Philippines, for instance, or Indonesia. But secondly, the implication of this argument is that you cannot be rational if you consider religion within your calculus. I would say that's not true. That people can obviously weigh the importance of religion and weigh religion in the way they make decisions, and make decisions rationally based on how much they value religion, right? It's unclear to me why the insertion of religion makes people irrational. What did CO say? CO basically says it's hard to root out abuse. I think there are two important things to say about this. The first one is that generally in politics, there are obviously multiple candidates, right? So now there'll be multiple people competing for power, and obviously there is a race to be scrupulous, right? Like if you're there's obviously a race to be scrupulous because you have multiple people to choose from and multiple figures of authority. But second and more importantly, people who abuse other people do obviously violate doctrine for many, many reasons. And it would be very intuitive to point out the fact that they're violating doctrine when they're abusing children. Any person can do that. If you're a common Christian, you can obviously see how bad it is that like there are bishops abusing children. And for those reasons, they could be rooted out. For all these reasons, very happy to propose.
Hello. Can everyone?
I'd like to thank the government whip for that speech and welcome the opposition whip, who, yes, we can hear to conclude today's debate.
Let me summarize Evan's logic and government's logic in less than a minute. If there's racism in the United States of America, they're the side who would say, then okay, just go back to Africa. Or if there's like religious intimidation happening in the United States of America, they're the team that would be happy to say that, okay, go back to the Middle East where there are more Muslims. We have three issues that we want to talk about. First is, where is religious tolerance and expression better off in what world? Secondly, the question of where are religious people more protected? But lastly, where are secular governments become more accommodating and where will they improve? Let's go on to the first issue. Where is religious tolerance and expression better off? Because coming from opening government, they were talking about the state needs to articulate different types of morality and people don't get to live their lives in salvation, and their example is France. We have three main responses. Number one, there are non-discrimination laws that exist in different types of states. So even if France is harsh, there are still laws that make sure that they are not discriminated at the end of the day. But second response is, people can travel to a more tolerant place. So when you're talking about the European Union and you don't like France, then people have the option to go to UK or Spain, or like they can go to Southeast Asia where like Islam is more tolerated in Malaysia or Christianity is more tolerated in the Philippines, right? But the third response is, even if there is a non-secular state that offers citizenship, we told you that one, it lessens people in secular states who demand for tolerance and religious self-expression. So you actually lessen the activists who can hold the state to account to be more accommodating. But secondly, coming from Josh, highly non-responded from Evan, saying that it creates an excuse why states like France could be more intolerant because they can just say, you already have a citizenship somewhere else in a different religion anyway, so go there instead and we won't be forced to change ourselves. What is the comparative? In government's world, secular states will be less tolerant and will have lesser reasons why they need to be tolerant. But secondly, they're even likelier to revoke citizenships because dual allegiance and citizenship is not allowed technically in most countries. But in opposition's world, we think that there are more protesters for religious expression because they choose to stay and challenge those particular systems, especially of those lack of alternatives. But secondly, we think governments are forced to be more tolerant at the end of the day because different minorities will be traveling in different type of countries at the end, and therefore there are more people who can challenge those particular ideals and give them more religious expression. Eventually, the burqa ban will also be banned, and we can allow like self-expression of women, especially in Islam. But the Deputy Prime Minister comes here and talked about, well, there's legitimate choice and values, and we don't want people to be coerced or to be forced to compromise their values. We have two main responses to that main idea. Number one, we think compromise is actually good, especially in the context of Sharia law. Because in Sharia law, it promotes stoning women and gay people, especially when they are having like sexual relationships at the end of the day. So we think that is good. But even if you don't buy that response, even if the compromise is bad, there is worse coercion happening in states with complete Sharia law or laws within Christianity, where children are punished based on violating religious dogma, and they are excommunicated and being told that they are going to hell and they have no hopes in their life. What is the comparative? In Gov's paradigm, abusive religious sects and ideals will flourish as legitimate countries, as legitimate regions and governments. What does this mean? This means the Amish who are sexist will have now like good legal legitimate background. Like Buddhism, who does not allow women to own land in their particular religion. Or Sharia law that justifies killing people who practices sodomy. In government side, they're creating countries where exclusion of different cultures is actually legitimized. What is happening better in opposition? We think alternatives exist at the end, but secondly, we have a melting pot of different cultures that can help challenge these abusive norms coming from the government. But lastly, we challenge face-to-face regressive conservative ideals in an equal platform in public. That means me as an atheist can talk to someone who is Buddhist or Amish or someone who is a bigot and actually have conversations and discourse with them such that our society develops as a united front and as a whole. But it's weird coming from closing when they talked about refugees are better off in their side. We have like 5 simple responses. Number one, it's not true. These countries will be selective in their side. So like a Christian country will only like select Christians. They will ignore like Islamic refugees. But secondly, like many people will be coerced to profess to be part of a religion. We're talking about like desperate refugees at the end, and we don't want them to be coerced to enter a religion either. Thirdly, we can just use the money to protect refugees rather than like using money to create like an entire state. That's why it's actually hard to create like a Kurdish state, because that costs like billions and trillions of dollars. But fourth, a government assumes that all refugees are religious, right? Like many refugees are not religious at all. But lastly, we think many of the religious refugees around the world come from prosecuted religious minorities, and the reason why they're leaving is because they want to escape the religious majority at the end of the day, which means in their policy or paradigm, they're bringing back the religious people where they were hiding from. But what did Josh say in this debate? He asked her the question, where are religious people better off, right, and more protected? Because Josh characterized that, yeah, it's true in the Vatican. The reason why it's harder to tackle pernicious abusers like child molesters, priests, is because Vatican has a particular state. It's sacrosanct. That means that it can hide there at the end of the day. It can choose whether it has like powers to give like the criminal back to the particular state. It can choose to hide those priests there. We think that there are countries that are going to be suspicious. They're going to say, are you Islamic enough? Are you Christian enough? And they are likely to be even more authoritarian with providing like mandatory Bible sessions or Quran readings at the end of the day. So this is links back to the question of where are secular governments more better, and where is it improving? And we told you that it's about melting pot of cultures existing in these particular countries. You have more allies for protest and protecting vulnerable minorities, like immigrants are helping each other's immigrants at the end. So here's the comparative that we'd like to offer in this last part. In terms of secular governments, in the government side, it justifies non-tolerance at the end of the day with the existence of this type of alternative. But in opposition side, people and governments are now forced to be now tolerant because they have consistent exposure of these melting pot of cultures, and they're likelier to accept their next door neighbor because of the discourse and the challenging this type of regressive values face to face in reality. We are very proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for a really good debate. I just want to check, does anyone know if we stay in this room or us judges are going to be assigned another room?
I think you stay while we leave.
Yeah, let me just double check.
That's what we did in quarters.
I think Vishnu, the Orcom is going to put the judges in another room.
Okay, I'll let him know.
Cool. So we'll just all head back to the main auditorium.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks everyone so much. That was fun.
Thank you for the debate, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.